Every day, we see the darker side of the world around us. We witness how people can hurt others in ways that are hard to understand. It's a sad part of life, but it's something we can't ignore. As someone who dives into the world of crime, I'm here to share the most shocking stories and try to understand what drives people to do such things. I'm Michael, and today, I've got another unreal true crime story for you. On the night of July 8th, 2019, everything seemed quiet in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. But inside a house in Union Township, something terrifying was happening. Two young brothers sat frozen in fear. Marky Mason, just 8 years old, and his younger brother had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. A man they once trusted, a man who had been welcomed into their home, had suddenly turned violent. Yelling filled the air. Things were being thrown. Then a knife appeared, and the shouting turned into something even worse. In just minutes, everything fell apart, and by the end of the night, only one of the boys would survive. How did this happen? Who was the man responsible? And could it have been prevented? This is the heartbreaking story of Marky Mason, a little boy whose tragic fate left a community searching for answers and justice. Mark Edward Mason Jr., lovingly called Marky, was born on November 24th, 2010, in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. He was the eldest son of Maram and Mark Mason Sr. Maram's journey to the U.S. began years before Marky's birth. Originally from Syria, she moved to Newcastle in 1999, facing the daunting challenge of adjusting to a new country without knowing English. She spoke only Syrian Arabic and French, making daily life difficult. Enrolled in the Newcastle area school district as a young student, she found a guiding hand in a French teacher who helped her navigate her new surroundings. Over time, Maram became fluent in English and pursued a certification in phlebotomy at Beaver County Community College. After completing her studies, Maram worked at ARC Human Services in Beaver County, assisting individuals with developmental challenges. To make ends meet, she also took a waitressing job at Olive Garden and another local restaurant. During this time, she met Mark Mason Sr., and the two eventually married, welcoming two sons, Marky first, followed by his younger brother a year later. Despite their best efforts, the marriage didn't last. When they divorced, Maram was granted custody of the boys, but both parents remained committed to co-parenting equally. They ensured that Marky and his brother grew up in a stable and loving environment. Their childhood in Newcastle was filled with the joys of sibling bonds. Playful laughter, video game marathons, and the occasional argument over toys. Marky and his younger brother were inseparable, calling each other best friends. Marky loved riding his bike through the neighborhood, playing tag and watching cartoons. He had a deep passion for Legos, spending hours constructing elaborate designs. His love for adventure extended to the outdoors, where he enjoyed fishing trips with his father and exploring local parks. Weekends were special, as Marky and his mother would spend time cooking together, baking cookies, and preparing meals. He was also fascinated by superheroes, especially Spider-Man, and often imagined himself as a hero saving the day. This admiration for justice fueled his dream of one day becoming a SWAT team officer, a goal he eagerly shared with adults around him. Marky's intelligence was evident from an early age. At school, he excelled in math and art, displaying both an analytical mind and a creative spirit. His bright personality made him a natural at making friends, and teachers praised him for his kindness. Whether he was sharing snacks or comforting a lonely classmate, Marky always put others before himself. On the playground, he had a knack for organizing games so that everyone felt included, and if disagreements arose, he was often the one to mediate. It was clear that Marky had a promising future ahead. However, as time passed, his home life began to change in ways that sharply contrasted with the warmth he brought to school. The shift began when Maram entered a relationship with Keith Burley, a 43-year-old man who was serving time in prison. Their connection started through a website called WriteAPrisoner.com, a platform where inmates can create profiles and communicate with people on the outside through letters, emails, and phone calls. While some use these sites for support and companionship, others form deeper, even romantic relationships, just as Maram and Keith did. Keith's past was troubling. In 1999, at the age of 23, he was convicted of third-degree murder and burglary after shooting a Newcastle man in the back of the head. His sentence was 20 to 40 years in prison, a punishment that, given the severity of the crime, some might consider surprisingly lenient. While serving time in prison, Keith faced additional charges following two separate incidents in which he was accused of assaulting fellow inmates. It was during his incarceration that Maram stumbled across his profile on an inmate pen pal website. Out of curiosity, or perhaps a need for connection, she decided to send him a message. What started as an exchange of letters quickly deepened into something far more serious. Over the course of several months, their correspondence grew into a bond that raised many eyebrows. Against all odds, Keith had served only the minimum 20 years of his 20 to 40-year sentence. In March 2019, he was released on parole. With his newfound freedom, Keith and Maram's relationship transitioned from written words to real life. Maram soon introduced him to her two sons, a decision that their biological father strongly opposed. However, despite his objections, Keith wasted no time inserting himself into the children's lives. At first, everything seemed fine. He presented himself as a changed man, someone who had left his past behind. Marky and his younger brother, ever trusting, accepted him with open arms, even calling him by his nickname, Bud. Yet, beneath the surface, Keith remained the same volatile man he had always been. People who knew him described him as unpredictable, manipulative, and capable of explosive anger. Those closest to him often feared what he might do when provoked. His relationship with Maram soon reflected this side of him. Arguments became more frequent, and physical altercations were not uncommon. Before long, his presence shattered the once loving dynamic that Maram and her sons had shared, turning their home into a place of fear rather than security. Then came the night of July 8, 2019, a night that would change everything. Maram had picked Keith up from a relative's house while her two boys dozed peacefully in the back seat of the family's car. Keith had planned to stay the night with them, as he often did. But tensions between the couple had been brewing for some time, and that evening they reached a breaking point. Needing to refuel, Maram pulled into a nearby gas station. She asked Keith if he could pump the gas for her. His response was immediate and furious. He flat out refused and snapped at her to do it herself. The argument escalated quickly. The topic shifted to Maram's missing phone, and frustration boiled over. Deciding she had had enough, Maram told Keith she was taking him back to where she picked him up. That's when Keith snapped. Enraged, he lunged at Maram, wrapping his left hand around her throat while his right fist pounded her face. A ring on his finger split the skin around her left eye, leaving a deep gash. Her cries of pain jolted the boys awake. As they opened their eyes, they saw their mother gasping for air, Keith's hand still around her neck. Terrified, they begged him to stop. Instead, he took his violence a step further, leaning in and biting Maram's cheek with brutal force. With blood trickling down her face, Maram fought through the pain and threw the car into drive. Her only thought was to get to safety. She sped toward the Newcastle Fire Department, desperate for help. The boys, sobbing in the back seat, clung to each other as their mother leaned on the car horn, trying to get the attention of anyone inside the fire station. But before anyone could intervene, Keith acted. He stormed out of the passenger seat, marched around the car, and yanked Maram from behind the wheel. Overpowering her with ease, he slammed her onto the pavement. Then, standing over her, he uttered 4 chilling words that would haunt her forever. "I'm kidnapping the children." Keith climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and sped off, leaving Maram battered on the ground, screaming in agony as she watched her terrified sons pressed against the car windows, helpless prisoners in their own vehicle. Keith drove the boys to a house in Union Township, a place neither of them had ever been before. After pulling into the dark driveway, he shoved them roughly inside. As soon as they stepped into the unfamiliar home, his rage exploded again. He began throwing objects around the room, his screams reverberating through the house. Then, in a terrifying burst of violence, he grabbed both boys by the throat, one in each hand, choking them until their cries became gasps. When he finally released them, Marky and his brother sobbed, trembling in fear. But the nightmare was far from over. Keith left the room briefly, only to return with something far more terrifying: a gun. He raised it and pointed it directly at one of the boys' heads. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, he realized something. The magazine was missing. Frustrated, he stormed off in search of it, ordering 2 teenage boys who lived in the house to help him find the missing piece. While Keith and the teens searched, Marky and his brother were left upstairs in a bedroom with the older boys, who, shockingly, continued playing video games as if nothing was wrong. Moments later, Keith returned, but this time he wasn't holding the gun. Instead, a knife glinted in his grip. Before either child could process what was happening, Keith lunged at Marky. The attack was sudden and merciless. In a blind, frenzied rage, he drove the blade into the 8-year-old's small body over and over again. His younger brother screamed, begging Keith to stop, but his cries went unheard. Desperate to save his brother, the 7-year-old ran into the kitchen, grabbed a chair, and tried to fight back. But he was no match for a grown man consumed by violence. Keith didn't stop until Marky had been stabbed 146 times. With each brutal strike, he shouted the same chilling word: "Die! Die! Die!" The younger boy, horrified beyond comprehension, realized there was only one option left. He had to run. Terrified and desperate, Marky's younger brother managed to escape the house. He sprinted down the driveway, past the darkened streets, and down a hill toward the nearest fast food restaurant just a few blocks away. As he reached the drive-thru, he frantically waved his arms, trying to get the attention of anyone who could help. Customers waiting for their orders quickly exited their vehicles, rushing to the little boy's aid. Through tears and panic, he managed to tell the strangers what had happened just down the street, that his brother was in danger. Within moments, someone dialed 911. When police arrived at the residence, the horror inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. Marky's lifeless body lay in a pool of blood in the living room. The walls and floor were splattered with evidence of the brutality he had endured. Even seasoned investigators were left shaken by the sheer violence of the scene. But Keith was gone. Realizing that Marky's brother had escaped, Keith had fled into the night. Authorities immediately launched a multi-state manhunt. Leads poured in as law enforcement agencies worked tirelessly to track him down. Eventually, the search led them to Youngstown, Ohio, just 19 miles from the crime scene. 9 hours after Marky's murder, Keith was spotted on Market Street in downtown Youngstown. U.S. Marshals quickly moved in, forming a perimeter with weapons drawn. Surrounded and with nowhere to run, Keith surrendered without a fight. He was arrested on the spot. Shortly after his capture, Keith was extradited back to Pennsylvania to face a slew of charges, including simple assault, terrorism, kidnapping, and criminal homicide. In a move that baffled both legal experts and the public, Keith chose to represent himself in court. His behavior during preliminary hearings was erratic, often filled with bizarre attempts to deflect responsibility. At one point, he demanded that the entire jury panel be replaced, claiming that because none of the jurors were black, he wouldn't receive a fair trial. His motion was swiftly denied. The already delicate proceedings faced further delays when a juror had to be excused due to the emotionally charged nature of the case. Nearly 4 years after Marky's tragic death, Keith's murder trial finally began in August 2023. During his opening statement, Keith attempted to argue that authorities had planted a piece of clothing among his belongings at the time of his arrest. However, the prosecution quickly shut down this claim, presenting clear video evidence showing Keith wearing the exact clothing when he was apprehended. In another strange tangent, Keith complained that his repeated transfers between jails and state prisons had subjected him to prolonged artificial lighting, allegedly damaging his eyesight. How this related to the brutal murder of an 8-year-old remained a mystery to everyone in the courtroom. The prosecution, in stark contrast, laid out a meticulous and compelling case. They detailed Keith's violent criminal past, his history of unrelenting aggression, and how his deep-seated rage culminated in the senseless murder of Marky Mason. Prosecutors theorized that Keith had taken out his frustrations about his relationship with Maram on the person he knew would hurt her most, her child. Marky's murder, they argued, was driven purely by malice and an uncontrollable hatred toward his girlfriend. Several members of Marky's family took the stand, including the one person who had witnessed the horror firsthand, his younger brother. Now 11 years old, the boy bravely sat before the court and recounted the events of that fateful night. When the prosecutor gently asked, "Can you tell us what happened to Marky?" the boy's response was heartbreakingly simple. "He got killed. He jumped on Marky and was stabbing him. I watched and I hit him with a chair." The weight of his words hung in the air, leaving the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Then Marky's father took the stand. Overwhelmed with grief, he struggled to find the words to describe the emptiness he had felt since losing his son. At one point, emotions boiled over. Unable to contain his fury, he exchanged profanities with Keith, forcing deputies to intervene and separate them before tensions escalated further. Finally, it was Maram's turn. Reliving the events of July 8, 2019, was almost unbearable, but she summoned the strength to tell her son's story. At one point during her testimony, she found herself making eye contact with the man who had taken her child's life. Even as Keith cross-examined her, the same man who had once called himself her partner, the same man who had inflicted unimaginable pain upon her family, she remained composed. Keith, in yet another bizarre move, asked an irrelevant question. "When did our relationship officially end?" Maram, without hesitation, delivered a response that left the courtroom silent once again. "When you killed my son." Throughout the grueling trial, Keith never once displayed a shred of remorse. He sat in court, indifferent, as evidence of his horrific crime was laid bare before the jury. In the end, it took them just 15 minutes to reach a verdict. In August 2023, the former felon, now a convicted child killer, was found guilty of both first-degree and second-degree murder. At 47 years old, he was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, to be served concurrently and without the possibility of parole. Markey's tragic death sent shockwaves not only through Newcastle but across the nation. The brutal murder of an innocent 8-year-old boy at the hands of a man who should have never been free to begin with left many questioning how this could have happened. While Marham was undoubtedly another victim of Keith's violence and manipulation, the haunting question lingered. Why had she allowed a convicted murderer into her home and around her children? There was no easy answer. But in the wake of Markey's death, Newcastle came together. Public vigils were held in his honor, where hundreds of mourners gathered to remember the bright, loving child taken far too soon. At his school, classmates left flowers, letters, and artwork on his desk, a small tribute to a friend they would never see again. On July 15, 2019, family, friends, and members of the Newcastle community gathered at St. Elias Orthodox Church to say their final goodbyes to Markey Mason. His small white casket was covered in flowers, while pictures of his bright smile served as a poignant reminder of the joy he brought into the world. The grief was immeasurable, but so was the love that surrounded him in his final farewell. Markey's story is now more than just a heartbreaking tragedy. It is a call to action. His memory lives on, not just in the hearts of those who knew him, but in the ongoing fight to protect children and prevent violent offenders from slipping through the cracks of the system. His name has become a symbol of hope, awareness, and change. Though his life was taken far too soon, his legacy endures, ensuring that his story will never be forgotten. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.